Mr. Alaric Dubois, a man who had dedicated his life to the elegant mechanics of time, held a deeply personal conviction: chaos was merely a failure of design. To him, the universe was a celestial clock, and every soul within it a delicate movement of gears and springs, intended to run in harmonious sequence. Thus he had accepted the invitation from his old friend, Dr. Eris Thorne, with a rare sense of anticipation. "You must see it, Alaric," Thorne's letter had urged, his handwriting growing frail but his intellect as sharp as ever. Evelyn Ashworth's Hakone Gardens. It is more than a garden, it is a statement. A thesis on the subjugation of nature's chaos to man's will. It will be a balm to your orderly soul. As his car ascended the winding mountain road, the first premature flakes of snow began to drift down, clinging to the dark pines like powdered sugar. The air grew colder, purer. When he finally passed through the imposing wooden gates of the estate, Dubois felt a grudging admiration. The garden was a masterpiece. Every stone lantern, every artfully twisted pine, every rake pattern in the white gravel seemed placed with a horologist's precision. It was a landscape sculpted by an iron roll. Dr. Thorne greeted him on the steps of the grand, Meiji-era house, a fragile figure wrapped in a thick woolen coat. "Alaric, welcome. Did I not tell you it was perfection? It is a formidable display of control," Eris Dubois conceded, his Swiss-French accent clipping the words with care. "To impose such stillness upon the wildness of nature requires obsession." "Obsession," Thorne chuckled, a dry, rattling sound, "is Evelyn's defining characteristic. He is a genius, but a genius of absolute, suffocating control. Over his plants, his staff, his family. Remember that as you admire his handiwork." The warning, delivered with a faint smile, hung in the cold air. A civil war. The dinner party that evening was a masterclass in civilized warfare. The storm, which the weather reports had promised would be a mere dusting, was rapidly intensifying, its moans echoing around the house like a restless spirit. Inside, the atmosphere was just as turbulent. Evelyn Ashworth, handsome and silver-haired, held court at the head of a long mahogany table. His charisma was a tangible force, a spotlight he directed at will, leaving those outside its beam in chilly shadow. He spoke of his triumphs, of orchids coaxed into bloom against impossible odds, his voice booming over the rising wind. His wife, Beatrice, sat opposite him, a figure of porcelain fragility. Her family had owned this land for centuries. Ashworth had merely married into it, transforming her ancestral home into his personal monument. She watched him now not as a wife, but as a deposed monarch observing a usurper on her throne. Her smiles were brittle, her silence heavy with unspoken grievances. Julian Croft, the young man introduced as a journalist, was anything but. His questions were scalpels, disguised as compliments. "To have rescued the Cypripedium formosanum from near extinction, Mr. Ashworth, it's a legacy few men could dream of. Though I recall a paper, some years ago, by a promising young researcher who claimed to have stabilized it first. His name escapes me." Ashworth's eyes hardened for a fraction of a second before his charming mask slipped back into place. "In science, Mr. Croft, many hands till the same soil. It is the one who reaps the harvest who is remembered." The threat was delivered with the smoothness of polished steel. And then there was Eleanora Vance. For 20 years, she had been Ashworth's shadow, his devoted protégé. She was a plain, unassuming woman who seemed to absorb the ambient tension of the room until she vibrated with it. She followed Ashworth's every gesture with the anxious, pleading eyes of a believer beginning to doubt their God. When he spoke of his discovery, she would flinch almost imperceptibly, a tightening of the muscles around her mouth, a flicker of pain in her eyes, before her face would smooth again into its placid mask. "The gardens must be prepared for a storm like this," Ashworth announced, raising his glass. "The weak branches will be torn away. The flawed specimens will perish. Only that which is strong, pure, and well-tended will survive to see the morning. It is nature's most brutal and most honest law." He swept his gaze across the table, and in the flickering candlelight, it was clear to Dubois that he was no longer speaking of horticulture. A scream in the storm sleep offered little respite that night. The world outside had dissolved into a white, howling fury. The wind shrieked, rattling the window frames and sending drafts snaking across the floors. Just after midnight, a sound managed to tear through the gale's roar, a sound from within the house itself. It was the unmistakable cadence of a furious argument. A man's voice, deep and enraged Ashworth's roaring accusations. It was answered by another voice, higher pitched, pleading and then defiant. The words were indistinct, but the raw emotion was not. The argument escalated, culminating in a man's bellow of pure rage, a woman's sharp cry of terror, and then a sickening, heavy thud. After that, there was only the wind. An oppressive, unending silence descended upon the house, a silence far more terrifying than the argument that had preceded it. The vanishing morning brought a world bleached of all color and sound. The Hakone gardens lay entombed beneath a meter of fresh, immaculate snow. The power lines were down, the phone lines dead. The single mountain road leading to the estate had vanished, erased from the landscape. They were utterly, completely trapped. And Evelyn Ashworth was gone. His bed, cold and pristine, had not been slept in. A frantic search of his study, the library, and the main living areas revealed no sign of him. "He must have gone out," Beatrice said, her voice a thin thread of sound. She stood at a large window, staring into the blinding white. The fool. He was obsessed with the glasshouse thermostats in a storm. He probably went to check on his precious orchids and was overcome. The suggestion hung in the air, a possibility that was both plausible and, for some, perhaps hopeful. But Alaric Dubois, a man attuned to the subtle ticks of human machinery, knew it was not that simple. The thud in the night had not been the sound of a man succumbing to the cold. It had been the sound of a mechanism breaking. The Red Room search party was formed, a grim, huddled assembly of the house's unwilling prisoners. Wrapped in heavy coats and armed with lanterns, they pushed their way through the suffocatingly deep snow, a single file of dark figures in a landscape of white. The path led, inevitably, to the cluster of glasshouses and the potting shed behind them, which also housed the powerful, oil-fired furnace that kept the delicate tropical plants alive. Julian Croft, impatient and strong, shouldered the snow-drifted door open. A wave of unnatural heat and the acrid, chemical smell of bleach washed over them. The shed was a place of work, of dirt and tools. But the scene before them was one of desecration. On the gray concrete floor, stark and obscene, was a vast, dark stain. It was mostly dry, but its edges were tacky, and a frantic pattern of scuff marks and swirls showed a desperate attempt to scrub it away. From the main pool of the stain, a smeared trail, a hideous calligraphy of violence, led directly to the heavy iron door of the furnace. It was blood, a horrifying, impossible amount of it. "My God," whispered Dr. Thorne, his breath pluming in the cold air as he leaned heavily on his cane. His face, already pale, had turned to wax. "This is not a shed. This is a slaughterhouse." There had been a murder of brutal finality, but the central, terrifying question remained. Where was the body of Evelyn Ashworth? The white prison, by some miracle of high-frequency radio, a message got through. Hours later, the churning sound of a heavy-duty, tracked vehicle announced the arrival of the police. Inspector Davies, a broad, weary-looking man whose grim face seemed made for investigating the worst of humanity, was now the ranking authority, but he was also a prisoner. The storm had sealed the estate completely. He, his 2 officers, and the house's occupants were now trapped together in a snowbound prison with a butcher. The potting shed was declared a crime scene. Forensic analysis was limited by the conditions, but the facts were brutal and clear. The blood was Ashworth's. The quantity indicated death. The bleach and scrub marks indicated a frantic cover-up. The murder weapon was missing, presumed to be a heavy, blunt instrument from the shed itself. Davies gathered the suspects in the grand, cold drawing room. "No one is leaving this estate," he announced, his voice flat and hard. "A man has been murdered. His body has been removed. One of you is responsible. Until I find out who, you will all remain here. You will not go anywhere without my permission. You are all suspects." His eyes scanned their faces, the icy widow, the vengeful rival, the terrified protégé, the dying patron. Each of them had a reason. Each of them was a captive. The first discovery, the search for the body, was a surreal and desperate exercise. Officers and staff poked and prodded at the colossal snowdrifts, their dark figures moving slowly against the blinding white. It was the police dog, a German shepherd named Kuma, who made the first hideous breakthrough. At the far end of the garden, a large steaming compost heap, kept active even in winter by biological decay, became the focus of the dog's frantic barking. Shovels were brought. The men began to dig, peeling back layers of soil, vegetable matter, and snow. A footman gagged, stumbling back with a hand over his mouth. Inspector Davies leaned forward, his face impassive but his eyes reflecting the horror. Protruding from the dark, rich earth, pale and lifeless, was a human hand. The nails were perfectly manicured. The terrible truth was now undeniable. Ashworth had not just been murdered and hidden. He had been dismembered. The search for a man had become a ghastly scavenger hunt. The red herring, the discovery that followed, seemed to bring the ghastly puzzle to a swift conclusion. A few feet from where the arm had been unearthed, an officer found a heavy leather glove, half buried in the snow. It was caked with a mixture of blood and dirt. It was quickly identified as belonging to Julian Croft. His arrest was immediate. Back in the library, which had become the nerve center of the investigation, Croft exploded with rage. "It's a setup. A plant," he roared, struggling against the officer holding him. "Yes, I fought with him. The man was a monster, a thief who stole my life's work. I told him I would expose him. I pushed him, he fell, but he was alive when I left the shed. Someone is framing me." His protests were vehement, his rage seemingly genuine, but the evidence was damning. He had the strongest motive, the physical strength for the gruesome task, and now, a crucial piece of evidence linking him directly to the disposal of the body. For Inspector Davies, it was a logical, satisfying, and blessedly simple solution to a horrific crime. He had his monster. A monster. The anomalous machine Alaric Dubois, however, found no satisfaction in simplicity. He believed that even the most chaotic actions had an underlying logic, however twisted. A crime of this nature, a violent murder followed by a high-risk, laborious dismemberment, was not the work of a cool-headed planner. It was the work of someone in a blind panic, and panic, Dubois knew, led to mistakes. He retreated from the emotional chaos of the investigation and turned his focus to the physical plant of the estate, to the garden as a machine. He found the old groundskeeper, huddled by a stove in his own small cottage. "The furnace, Mr. Dubois," the old man stammered, his hands shaking. "I've worked here 40 years. Never seen it run so hot. The gauges were deep in the red all through the night. It must have burned through a week's worth of oil. I came in this morning thinking the whole system was shot, that the thermostat had broken. A broken thermostat was a random event, a component failure. But what if it wasn't? What if it had been deliberately overridden? That was not chaos. That was design. Someone had needed intense, prolonged heat. Someone had used the furnace not just for warmth, but for annihilation. The interrogation of Eleanor Dubois found Eleanor in the tropical house, a humid, green world that stood in stark defiance of the frozen landscape outside. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth and sweet blossoms. She was staring at a wall of ferns, her expression vacant. She looked not just frightened, but hollowed out. "Miss Vance," Dubois began, his voice soft. He did not ask her where she was or what she saw. He asked about the machinery. "I am trying to understand the furnace. The groundskeeper tells me it malfunctioned. As if a switch had been flipped, a flicker of her old, competent self returned. With a dull, mechanical voice, she explained the intricacies of the heating system. She knew every valve, every bypass lever, every quirk of the thermostats. Her knowledge was not theoretical. It was the practical, hands-on knowledge of someone who had spent 2 decades tending to the lifeblood of the gardens. "It's a delicate system," she murmured, her eyes not meeting his. "If one part fails, everything is at risk. Everything can die." She began to tremble. "I am so frightened, Mr. Dubois. To be trapped here, knowing what one of us is capable of. It's monstrous." Dubois watched her. He saw her fear. But beneath it, he sensed something else. The profound, bone-deep wariness of a mechanism that had been under unbearable strain for far, far too long. Horror among the orchids, the final, ghastly discovery was made by Beatrice. Driven by a desperate, proprietary need to reclaim some part of her violated home, She had forced her way into the Serpentine house, her husband's personal sanctum. The air was warm and still. The magnificent orchids, his life's work, stood in silent, blooming rows. She had always hated the largest of them, a monstrous Paphiopedilum hybrid housed in a ceramic pot the size of a small cauldron. It represented, to her, the pinnacle of his arrogance. On a terrible impulse, she decided to move it to disrupt his perfect order. As she strained against its weight, the pot tilted, and a mound of loose soil spilled onto the tiled floor. With the soil came a man's shoe, and still inside it, a foot. Her scream was a shard of glass in the humid, silent air, a sound of utter, soul-shattering violation. Time stands still. The murderer is not Mr. Croft, Alaric Dubois announced that evening. He stood before the fireplace in the drawing room, addressing the small, terrified assembly. Outside, the snow had finally stopped falling, leaving the world in a state of absolute, frozen silence. He was merely the most convenient narrative, a story of revenge that served to obscure a much sadder, much more terrible truth. He turned to Inspector Davies, who stood with his arms crossed, his face a mask of skepticism. The glove inspector was a plant, a desperate act of misdirection. The true killer is not the strongest among you, nor the one with the most obvious motive. The killer is the one who knew the garden not as a place of beauty, but as a machine for sustaining life and for disposing of death. Anatomy of a crime. Dubois began to pace, his footsteps soft on the thick Persian rug. Let us consider the crime itself, a brutal, violent act in the potting shed. That part was chaos, a moment of passion and rage. But what followed was not. What followed was a problem to be solved, the problem of a human body. How to make it vanish? He looked at each of them in turn. The dismemberment. It is horrifying to contemplate. But look closer at the coroner's preliminary notes. The cuts, while gruesome, were not the wild hacks of a frenzied butcher. They were precise. They followed the joints. It was the work of someone with an innate, practical understanding of anatomy. He paused, letting the implication sink in. Or perhaps someone who has spent a lifetime pruning. Someone who knows exactly where to cut a branch from a trunk to ensure a clean separation, to minimize damage. The underlying logic is identical. Then, the disposal, he continued, his voice low and clinical. Hiding the pieces required an intimate knowledge of this estate. The compost heap, a place of rapid decomposition. The deep soil of a large pot, a place no one would think to look. And finally, the furnace. To operate it at maximum temperature for so many hours required manually bypassing the safety regulators. It required an expert's knowledge. The knowledge of the person responsible for the daily life and death of every plant in this garden. The blood-stained hand, he stopped his pacing. His clear, analytical gaze came to rest on the smallest, quietest, most unassuming figure in the room. He looked at the woman who had seemed to be a ghost, a shadow, for the past 2 days. You did not go to the potting shed with the intention of killing him, did you, Miss Vance? Eleanor flinched as if he had struck her. Her entire body began to shake violently. He discovered your secret, Dubois stated, not as a question, but as a fact. He found the documentation you had been compiling for years, the proof of his systematic theft of your work. He confronted you there in the shed, surrounded by the tools of your trade. He flew into a rage. He was a powerful man, used to getting his way. He called you a thief. He threatened you. He attacked you. Dubois painted the final, terrible scene. The shouting matched they had all heard. The terror of a woman who had been psychologically abused for 20 years, now facing physical violence from her tormentor. The heavy, iron-headed shovel used for mixing soil leaning against the wall. "You picked it up. You defended yourself," Dubois said, his voice softening with a note of something like pity. It was one blow, a single, desperate act of self-preservation, but it was enough. He fell, and he did not get up. It was an accident. But in that moment you were trapped. Trapped by the storm, trapped by the body of the man who had ruined your life. And so, in a state of shock and panic, you did the only thing your training and your instincts told you to do. You began to solve the problem. You began to prune. Confession in a snowstorm. A terrible, ragged sob tore itself from Eleanor Vance's throat. It was the sound of a structure collapsing under a weight it could no longer bear. The dam of her composure, so carefully maintained for 2 days, finally shattered into 1,000 pieces. "He said he would destroy me," she cried, her voice cracking, her words tumbling out in a torrent of guilt and horror. "He said I was nothing, a parasite who fed on his genius. He grabbed me by the throat. He was going to. I saw the shovel. I swung it. I just wanted him to stop. I didn't mean to kill him. I swear I didn't mean to." She confessed everything, her body racked with tremors. The accidental death, the blind, sickening panic that followed. She described how her mind had detached, how she had worked through the night in a fugue state, her actions guided by a cold, botanical logic that horrified her even now. She had treated his body like a diseased tree that needed to be removed from the garden. She had planted Croft's glove, a last-minute, desperate act of misdirection. As Inspector Davies and his officer gently led the weeping, broken woman from the room, Alaric Dubois walked to the large window and looked out at the silent, snow-covered world. The Crimson Snow of Hakone, a place of exquisite man-made order, torn asunder by the most primal human chaos. The storm had created a physical prison, but the true prison had been the one Eleanor Vance had inhabited for 2 decades, a cage of stolen dreams and silent resentment. In one terrible night she had broken free, only to build a new, more terrible one for herself, one from which she would never escape. The snow, he knew, would eventually melt. The seasons would turn. But the stain of this tragedy, he suspected, would remain on this beautiful, cursed garden forever.